Carrie, the fourth written and first published novel by Stephen King, is a classic story of revenge. Seen through the eyes of the titular character, Carrie White is a shy high school girl who discovers she has telekinetic powers and uses them on those who have bullied her on prom night, causing one of the worst disasters in American history. The novel was successful enough that it was adapted into a feature film in 1976, being the first of many films based on King's works, novels, novellas, and short stories alike. Directed by Brian De Palma, the film went on to become a major box office success, earned 2 Oscar nominations for Sissy Spacek and Piper Laurie respectively, and is not only regarded as one of the best films of that decade, but also as one of the greatest horror films of all time. Since then, the success has spawned a universally panned sequel, a made-for-TV remake that was supposed to lead a failed television series, and a stage musical, all of which happened in the last decade. And now, we have this.
There's one thing no one seems to understand. She wasn't some monster. She was just a girl.
The third film adaptation of Carrie was recently released this year, with Chloe Moretz in the title role and Julianne Moore as her overtly religious mother. Directed by Kimberly Pierce, the film receives mostly mixed reviews. Critics gave it some positive notice for taking a modern take on the story, even though the whole thing felt very beat by beat.
While I'd agree to that to some extent, I felt that the remake was fine in its own right. It's pretty fun at points, and the modern update for it worked, especially for those who haven't watched the original. Of course, one of its main themes in both films is bullying, which has been such a relevant subject in the last few years. However, there's more beyond that, and that's what's going to be explored here. The original and the remake will be compared and contrasted to see what's different between them, and if the changes have something to do with the modern popular culture that surrounds our society.
The first subject I'll touch on is bullying in the digital age. A good example of that would be the opening scenes of both the original and the remake, which I'd like to call the locker room scene. It's a very pivotal and somewhat cringe-worthy moment as it drives the story and gives you an idea of who our main character is and what exactly she's going through. Let's take a look at the original version. Carrie, like all the other girls, are in the locker room taking a shower and getting into their clothes after gym class. And while Carrie is showering, she starts to experience her first period. Having no knowledge of menstruation, she thinks she's bleeding to death. So she starts freaking out, scared out of her mind, and all the other girls react by laughing, pushing her away, and throwing tampons at her, chanting, "Plug it up." Now let's take a look at the remake. The remake pretty much follows the original beat by beat, and everything happens the way we remember it, at least in, that scene. However, the biggest change is this. Chris Hargison, one of the film's main antagonists, is filming the ordeal on her iPhone, and later posts the video up on YouTube. This makes the situation much worse than it was in the 1976 version, and to add to that, and here's where I skip a few beats ahead, after Chris dumps the pig's blood on Carrie in the pivotal and iconic prom scene, the video ends up being projected on a wall next to the stage, which of course doubles Carrie's rage. And you know what happens after that. Since the original film was made and set in the 70s, bullying is shown there in a more traditional manner. When I say traditional, I mean that it was usually a face-to-face issue, and on most occasions it only happened during the school day. Bullying was just seen as a minor life obstacle and not so much of a big deal. And by the end of that movie, you see that that's not the case. And that same message has translated over the past 20 to 30 years as we've seen through tragedies and the deaths and suicides of youth. With the technological advancements that surround us all, the common bully now has more options to take their torment on their victims. Online bullying is just as bad and at times even worse than traditional bullying. It can be done at any time from any location, and worst of all, can be shared to a very wide audience. All of it done anonymously. The next subject I'll touch on is sex and nudity. I'm going to use the locker room scene again as an example, because as I mentioned before, it paints a good picture on who Carrie is and what exactly she's going through. However, the scene elicited some mixed reactions from critics and audiences alike for a much different reason: nudity. We'll start with the original since it contains the female nudity, some of it full frontal. Now what you're seeing right now is the alternate version of that scene. It was reshot specifically for the TV broadcast version for obvious reasons. But more on the original version. There were those who called it gratuitous and totally unnecessary, and then there were those who didn't really attack it but rather questioned the realism of that scene. And after giving the original another watch, I questioned the scene as well. Now personally, I don't mind it when there's female nudity on screen. I'm a guy. But guys don't really get naked in front of each other in the locker, shower room. So I'm guessing women don't really do the same thing either. Do they? Probably not. So I was kind of happy that nudity wasn't included in the remake. They could have done it. They had the rating to do so, but it didn't happen. And I think this is the big reason why. It's a female-directed movie. Now, I'm not saying that there's a very distinct difference between male-directed films and female-directed films. I like to think that films like Point Break, American Psycho, and Bridesmaids have blurred those lines. I'm saying that most women have a better idea of how they should be portrayed more than some men do. When The Hollywood Reporter asked Chloe Moretz about there being no nudity in the remake, she said this: "I think that's the difference between a male and female director. Kim respects women immensely. You can just tell the difference in a male-directed movie and a female-directed movie. To have that security and have that bubble of having a female director, you felt safe. The shower scene was done so appropriately. We never showed any boobs or any naked women, whereas in the first one it was like boobs and vagina all over. It's really a story about a young girl who is being ostracized. It's not a story about sex. That's not what Carrie's looking for with Tommy. She just wants happiness and freedom." It's interesting she says that it's not a story about sex. And it's true. It's not. And looking over that quote, I feel like the original had more of a different view on sex than the remake does. They portrayed it more in a free manner, and they never really showed the consequences of it. I'm not saying they have to, but, if you're having sex without protection and you're a teenager, there is a consequence. I'll touch on scenes in the original and the remake where two prominent characters are having sex without any sort of protection. In the original, Chris and her boyfriend Billy are getting intimate, and he's on the receiving end of things. Whereas in the remake, this time, it's Sue and Tommy that are having sex, and then afterwards, Sue becomes pregnant. So unlike the original, the remake shows us the risk of teenage sex, especially without protection. The final subject I'll touch on is gore and violence, and the scene that will be a focus is the prom scene. I think we all know what happens here. So here's the original version of that iconic scene. Now, to be completely honest here, I couldn't really find a version of the remake's prom scene that was clear enough. So here's a clip from a TV spot that shows bits of it. I personally think it's better than how the trailer does it. It's short, but what can you do?
Carrie, rated R.
I mentioned in the beginning of the video that in the novel, the prom incident is one of the worst disasters in American history. And while neither the original or the remake comes close to capturing the scope of that, they're slightly different from each other in terms of death count. Very few happen in the original, but in the remake, there's more than a few. Not a lot, but there's enough. Enough to leave us strangely satisfied. At least somewhat. To use something I picked up on in a discussion my popular culture class had, it's the jolts of it all. I say jolts as in our fix. Every time my friends and I watch a horror film like Saw or Final Destination, we get this excitement and this rush from all the gory stuff that's happening. Because we know it's going to happen. And it's supposed to happen because it moves the story forward. And if it doesn't, then what do we pay to see then? It's a weird thing. And our culture has become so used to it at this point that there are people who don't really feel it matters anymore. But it does. It really does. Carrie always trotted the line between exploitive horror and social commentary, novel and films alike. On one hand, it represented the ultimate revenge fantasy for bullied children, and on the other, it also asked questions about the role society plays when one of its own snaps and turns lethal. The original has always been relevant throughout the years because it dealt with such a relevant subject that's been kept alive through various films and TV shows. And while the remake doesn't do too many new things with the story, it does take and elevate the theme for a new generation where various technologies and social media are intact. Yes, Carrie is a horror film, and an entertaining one, by all means. But the more we take time to really think about it, Carrie is also, of sorts, a story of tragedy.